Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to have a great closing for our first day. I'm going to be here just for 90 seconds because we have a treat, which is that our Vice President of Research of Universidad Los Andes, Jimena Hurtado, Vice President of Research and Creation, that's very important. Jimena Hurtado is going to chair this session. She is going to introduce our fantastic keynote speaker, Julieta Lemaitre. And I should say that Jimena Hurtado's important role is not only being our current Vice President of Research, she is one of the founders of our TREES initiative. So we are 2 times happy for having her chairing this session. I won't say any more because she is going to be, as I said, the chair, and she's going to present, as I said before, also our keynote speaker. So welcome, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this last session. And after this session, we will head to the last floor of this building, and we'll have a cocktail in the terrace if it's not too cold, otherwise in a room overlooking the terrace. Okay, welcome.
Thank you, Leopoldo. Thank you so much to you all for being here. So yes, Vice President for Research and Creation of this university, but most of all, founder of the TREES initiative, which is one of, I think, my greatest prides in this university. And so what I want to say today is just that I'm really happy to be here and to see that this is building and growing and that there are so many things that we can still do. It is obviously a privilege to welcome you to this plenary session and to do so from a place, as I said, that means so much to me. TREES was born here. Actually, I've got the vintage pin, if you look at it. It has changed, but this is the original one. And it was born at the Universidad de los Andes, which has a very specific and peculiar history as a university in this country. And it was founded and born from a question that it is hard to avoid in Colombia, and that I think is especially significant if we pose that question from this university. How do we make sense of an economy that does not work for everyone? In a country where inequality is not a statistical figure, but a daily lived reality. I had the privilege of being part of the founding team, and I have followed this initiative with care and admiration ever since taking on this administrative role I'm in now. TREES works on 3 fronts that, taken together, do something genuinely rare in academia. In research, it has built a situated agenda, one that takes seriously the specific conditions of the global south and engages with international networks working to renew political economy, not as a recipient of frameworks developed elsewhere, but as a conversation partner who has its own voice and its own questions. In teaching, it has accomplished something truly exceptional, building a community of practice that brings together educators working across different levels of the Colombian education system to collectively rethink how we teach economics and how we talk about inequality, and being able to convince economists around the globe that teaching is important. And in outreach, TREES looks for new ways to communicate, new ways to contribute to a better informed public conversation about inequalities, and to contribute to citizenship. These 3 components that reinforce one another and share a common goal, producing knowledge that travels, that makes a difference, and that teaches beyond the university walls. One of TREE's most important contributions is its insistence that inequality is not a single thing, There are inequalities, plural, that overlap, reinforce each other, and play out across different dimensions, and they frequently go unnoticed because we have learned to look in the same places. Part of what it means to renew the political economy of the Global South from the Global South is precisely to broaden that gaze, to look where we do not usually look, to ask about those who do not show up in the standard data, to accept that absence from the record does not mean absence from reality. Let me give you a personal example. This of what TREES does. TREES supported research project in which I participated is a project that I have been developing with Ricardo Salas, which sets out to recover the stories of women who have shaped economics in Colombia. The question is not whether women have been present in economics. Of course they have. The question is that they have contributed from places that official history has overlooked or chosen not to see. For those of us working in university leadership, a project like this is also a way of staying grounded in academic conversation, of keeping a line of thinking alive that feeds directly into the work of research management. And now we come to our invited keynote speaker, Julieta Lemaitre Ripoll, who knows exactly what I'm talking about, who knows that practice of looking in unexpected places. Her work as a scholar, has meant, in large part, going to where the law does not reach or arrives too late. A graduate of this university's law school with a master's in gender studies from New York University and a doctorate in juridical science from Harvard, Julieta has built her career around questions that legal scholarship was slow to take seriously. How do women displaced by war actually experience the law? What does justice look like when the state has failed repeatedly and systematically? How can legal tools be used not just to preserve the existing order, but to change it? From 2018, those questions led her to take on one of the most demanding roles in recent Colombian public life. Magistrate of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, la JEP. La JEP is an unprecedented experiment in the country's history, an attempt to respond to decades of violence through mechanisms that put truth, reparation, and non-repetition at the center. And it is also a conversation with experiences elsewhere. And I think that's what this conference wants to do. And this is what TREES is all about, too. For example, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission showed that transitional justice institutions can be built from within a society's own social and cultural fabric. We have learned from it, and now we can share many experiences. That kind of exchange among peoples of the Global South, among societies that share histories of violence and of searching for a way through, holds enormous potential for building collaborations that go well beyond academic dialogue. Julieta's work incarnates those connections. How academia can shed light on historical processes that shape us as a nation. As a magistrate, Julieta has worked on landmark cases involving kidnapping and conflict-related violence. She has brought to the tribunal a gender perspective that does not simply add women to the process, but fundamentally changes how harm is understood, how testimony is gathered, and how accountability is shaped. Her work shows how legal institutions can produce and entrench inequality, and how they can also, under the right conditions, help to undo it. Julieta, thank you for being here. It is a pleasure to have you back. and an honor to see how you have opened the way for us in academia to follow and learn from. Thank you for the consistency of a body of work that holds thought and action together. In her keynote today, I think Julieta will invite us to think about the rule of law from the inside, from the perspective of someone who has helped build it under extraordinary conditions. And she offers some things that economists in particular would do well to hear. That there are blind spots in the way our discipline understands inequality, and that law, transitional justice, and the lived experience of those who have been excluded can help us see them. That is precisely the conversation Trees exists to have. A conversation to which Universidad de los Andes hopes to keep contributing so that we can build a just and profoundly human society where we can all flourish and learn in a dense web of shared knowledge to build and explore possible futures with hope. Please join me in welcoming our colleague, professor, and magistrate, Julieta Lemaitre.
Hi, well, thank you so much for those kind words, Jimena, and I'm really happy to be here with the Trees founders. I'm very excited to see how this has turned out, and I hope to surprise you and to push you in unforeseen ways of looking at the state and the law. So my talk today is going to be called Reconstruction. And mostly I'm going to talk about the way Colombians have built a life, an ordinary life, after war and after losing all possessions and after fleeing. I always say that if there's something that defines us as a country, is that we're a country that would rather leave than fight. Well, there's 53 million Colombians, and 6 million of us have decided to leave rather than fight. So Europe has this glorification of war and of standing your ground, and I would rather die on my feet than live on my knees. Colombians generally, what we have done is we leave. So if you can imagine, there's about over a million families who in the last 20 or 30 years, probably at night, had this conversation. Shouldn't we leave? Aren't things getting too hard for us? Shouldn't we rebuild our life elsewhere? We're a nation of migrants. Every day, 1,000 Colombians leave Colombia thinking that they will not come back. Why and how this means, so it's hard to talk about this. And I want to show you a poem, but I also want to talk a bit about the we that usually comes up in these panels or in these conversations. So you'll notice panelists frequently talk about we, but who's the we? So generally, those of us who were educated in the wealthier countries try to establish a we that includes our professors, our former colleagues. It's a conversation where we are the people who run the world or the people who watch other people run the world. And we comment about it, we write op-eds about it, we write papers about it, or we get to run the world ourselves. And basically, that's the we. So I want to invite you to a different we, which is the people who've lost everything after war. And I love this poem by Wisława Szymborska. And I've also discovered that when people come to my court, I'm an investigative magistrate, and mostly what I've done in the last years is listen to people. A lot of them people who have fled the war, who are victims or perpetrators. And everybody, or from every camp, there's a moment where people can't really express what they're trying to say, and they'll say, oh, but magistrate, I wrote a poem. And they'll read poetry. Sometimes it's somebody else's poems. And I always wonder, what does poetry do in us or do for us? And I think that mostly what it does, and I'll say this as a professor, and it's just a wager, and you should probably ask somebody who knows about literature. I think that what poetry does for us is it has no theory. So it basically skips the part of the dissertation where you have to set out your literature. There's no lit review in poetry. It is what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you're getting from the moment. And this is basically what she's getting. This is Wisława Szymborska of what happens after a war. I'm going to pick up another mic. So I'm just going to read it and I'll come back to it at the end. After every war, someone has to clean up. Things won't straighten themselves up after all. Someone has to push the rubble to the side of the road so the corpse-filled wagons can pass. Someone has to get mired in scum and ashes, sofa springs, splintered glass, and bloody rags. Someone has to drag in a girder to prop up a wall. Someone has to glaze a window, rehang a door. Photogenic it's not, and it takes years. And the cameras have left for another wars. We'll need the bridges back, and new railway stations. Sleeves will go ragged from rolling them up. Someone, broom in hand, still recalls the way it was. Someone else listens and nods with unsevered head, but already there are those nearby starting to mill about who will find it dull. From out of the bushes, someone still unearths rusted-out arguments and carries them to the garbage pile. Those who knew what was going on here must make way for those who now know little, and less than little, and finally, as little as nothing. In the grass that has overgrown causes and effects, someone must be stretched out, blade of grass in his mouth, gazing at the clouds. And I love this poem because it both shows that after a war, someone has to clean up, and it also shows that eventually we do hope that the war will be over to a point where people won't really know what it was about or what happened or who did what to whom, because there's a point where memory just refuels the next war. So I think it's a great poem. And this is a picture from today's New York Times. And basically, as in the picture, that's a woman in Tehran cleaning out her bombed out apartment. And as in this picture, a lot of this work, because it is work that's done after a war, is done by women. So basically, it's women who clean the dead, who mourn them, who bury them, who keep their memories and keep the graves clean. It's also women who pick up the rubble, figure out if something was left over, tend to the children, feed people, take care of the sick, take care of the elderly. It's basically a woman's job, which is made invisible in ordinary society. But in a war-torn society, it stands right in the middle of the possibility of building life after war. Since I'm betting all of you are economists, except for Rodrigo and me, and that's about it, there's a lot of data if you like data. I mean, there's a lot of data on the Colombian conflict. And there's a lot of government institutions that produced a lot of reports. This is just a few of the graphs. You can get, I think literally hundreds of thousands of them. If you don't know about it, this is pretty much the war that I'm talking about. These are the years. And the peak is going to be the year 2001. And it counts violent deaths in Colombia. And it starts in 1958, and that's the peak. It's mostly massacres and selective murder. That's the war that I'm talking about here. And people keep saying, no, there's still a war. There's really not in number, not in terms of the data. I mean, there's violence, there's something else going on, but we don't have that anymore. If you want to know, who did that, if you look at the upper chart, I think I have a little, that first line, these are the actors. That's the paramilitary army who did most of that. And the blue line's going to be before 2010. And then the orange line's going to be after 2010, when the paramilitary armies had demobilized. Then you'll find guerrillas, and you'll see that a whole bunch of guerrilla violence ended during the war. And then there's a 2016 peace deal, which also ended a lot of it. Then this other line is really mysterious because it's unknown people. But that descended as well, as did basically every form of violence in Colombia. If you look at people who are most likely to be killed violently, here's a chart. This first line is basically civilians. It's called other. And then the second line that you get here of people who are more likely to be killed in Colombia, that's community leaders. And I want to talk about, throughout this talk, what does that mean? How can it be that the second riskier thing to be in the war, besides just an ordinary person who might randomly get killed, is a community leader? And I want to talk about what community leaders do for communities and why they're at risk. But that's going to be the end of it. One of the problems, and I love this, I'm sure a lot of you have, or maybe more, I don't know, I'm betting a lot, have used this idea or this image or a similar image when you're trying to talk about silos in academia. So this is an illustration of that well-known, apparently Indian story about, in this case, it's 6 blind men who are taking to know what an elephant looks like. And then each one grabs a bit of the elephant and has his own theory and lit review and whatever about what the elephant looked like. But in a university, we tried to do this without ever having seen an elephant. Yeah. Colombia, over the years, has tried a lot of policy projects to address violence. These are a few of the logos. They'll seem familiar to some of you. So we have conditional cash transfers, constitutional reform, special justice, like the special jurisdiction for peace. We have rehabilitating territories where there was a war. We have programs for reincorporation. There's a lot of policy and programs around cleaning up after a war, I guess, when the state tries to do it. And I'm in one of those. I'm in the most recent one, which is a special jurisdiction for peace. There I'm working. I'm an investigative magistrate. And mostly what I have to do is listen to people talk about a war where the worst of it happened 25 years ago. And people are still angry. They're still hurt. They're still trying to rebuild their lives after the war, but not like they did at the beginning. So this is Ana Luz. She never authorized the use of her last name. This is in 1996. This is exactly the year when she fled her home in a rural region of Urabá and came to the outskirts of Cartagena. And you're seeing her 2 daughters and her first home, which, as she described it, was basically a puddle of mud. And what happened afterwards? If you look at Bogota, now that you're here, but basically most Colombian cities, pretty much half of the city was built by people who left the countryside or smaller cities and came to Bogota in what we called self-construction. So this is usually what their first home looked like, with makeshift materials. And here's the water system and no electricity. But it's the first shelter. This is in Bogota, so the insides will be lined with newspaper to keep out the cold. And it's basically a place to sleep. And if you see, if you could find a plastic bag, here it is, that's a sewage. But then, after probably 10 years, somebody convinced the state not only not to expel them, which happens in other countries. Here, there's been general forbearance of people building a city in land they do not own. And there's also been a tradition since late 1950s. Actually, the first law that authorized this is from 1959, specifically in Bogota, passed by the Bogota Council, that promoted that people who did not have a home build their own homes and organize themselves in community, like in neighborhood associations called juntas de acción comunal, community action boards, to build neighborhoods. So they would get some protection from the government, that they would not be expelled from the land, perhaps deeds, usually no deeds, but they would ask for stuff. There you have electric light poles, and this is the next version of that house, usually built by themselves. And there you have stairs, which is really useful if there's a lot of mud. And then this is Bogota today. It started out that way, and now you have 3-story houses, and you have a park, and the city now builds public spaces, and it's like a regular city. But it blew my mind the first time that I realized it. I hope it still blows yours, that half of our city was built house by house, mostly by people who were going to live there. Maybe they'll hire somebody to help. Initially, they had like neighborhood, all the neighborhood would pitch in the harder parts of construction, and then the family would figure out the rest of the house themselves. City planners hate this because it's not sismo resistente. If there's ever an earthquake, this is all going down. But the Colombian state has the wisdom not to bulldoze all this stuff down, but try to get it to come to legality slowly. So the last time that I did research in one of these neighborhoods, which was a bit over 10 years ago, you could still walk into a bread shop and you'll see signs that says, I'm selling my house, it has a deed. I'm selling my house, it has no deed, it has no legal property, but I'm still selling it. So slowly people are coming in. Of course, electricity is not free. The first thing that people get is a bill for their electric service, even though they don't own the property. Recently, they also get taxed for the property, which is kind of fun, even if they don't own it. And that's our cities, and it was built by people who didn't just build the houses, they also organized. And this is a meeting of internally displaced women in Bogota a few years ago in front of the mayor's city hall demanding their rights. They organized, they learned how to speak legalese, and they learned how to get stuff from the government. And they helped me understand, first, what's the first question that you ask whenever you're doing research? Is who's the authority here? ¿Quién manda aquí? And the answer is not what I used to teach at law school. The answer sort of varies. And then theoretically, some of us still teach Weber, which I think is kind of crazy. But the whole idea is that a state is a monopoly of legitimate violence. I think some of us still teach that. And Mann called it despotic power. And James Scott, who I think is much more fun than Weber, called it the protection racket. But then Mann has this idea that's been written about by a whole bunch of political scientists on infrastructural power that really defines modern states, which is you can't really have a state just built on fear, just on the police. You need to provide something to people. What do you provide? Well, you provide the regulation of social relations. And that's us, right? That's lawyers. We regulate social relations through law and courts. So, and the offer of public policy, which is what economists are frequently thinking about, right? What kind of what services should we be providing? What do we have money for? Where do we get the money from? And how do we provide it? And that generates power. But the state is not the only provider of either despotic power or infrastructural power. The state has rivals, all sorts of rivals. And I want to show you a model that I still think is, at least it humors me. I call it a market model of the state, in which there's a supply of state, a supply of government, and then people like these women decide whether or not they accept the offer, or if there's another offer of government that they might subscribe to that would be more legitimate. And so I figured out 4 types of supply-side governance. The first one is the one that we teach, which is the constitutional form of government. There's a wonderful literature on insurgent or rebel governance, which is governance of certain parts of our countries by illegal outfits or criminal organizations or insurgencies or paramilitary outfits. Then there's some literature and which is fascinating, about co-government, in which criminal organizations sort of partner up with legal government to govern certain regions of the country or certain parts of what a state does, such as the provision of public services. And we call it in the university corruption usually. So when we're talking about corruption in healthcare, that means that the provision of healthcare is co-governed, probably with the mafia, because what mafia usually do is that they keep part of the profits more than what they're supposed to. And but there's also co-government with private companies, with organized crime, different types of mafia schemes. There's network of patronage and political clienteles. And these are all organizations that sort of insert themselves into government. So government in part works the way it's supposed to, and in part works as a profit-generating machine for these illegal outfits that co-govern. And Ana Luz, who I showed you, was the first person who made me realize this, because she told me a story that made no sense. So I'd been following the NGO that supported Ana Luz and the other women of this organization that had built their own neighborhood in Turbaco to ask for stuff from the local government. One of the things that they knew they had a right to, it was one of their social and economic rights, they knew they had a right to healthcare. They had their healthcare card. They were on the CISBEN. They were on the government scheme to provide healthcare services. And yet the local institution, the IPS, that was supposed to provide the healthcare services, refused to provide the services. They had no appointments. They never got to them. They never gave them the services. And the first thing they said is, the woman who trained us, the lawyer, taught us what to do. They had a tutela. Before they asked for a meeting with the hospital manager, they had an acta, like they wrote down the whole meeting. They made the guy sign it. You have to give us our rights. We have these rights. They read the Constitution. They did the whole thing they were supposed to do. And then she said, and then the next day, these guys on a motorcycle come by the neighborhood and they tell us, if you keep fucking up with this healthcare thing, the next day your mouth will be full of flies, because there will be a corpse. And she said, so we stopped it because we know violence. We know what it's like. I had a son killed because of this. I'm not going to mess with the local government. The thing is, in this town, as in many towns, healthcare provision is in part co-opted by some local rich guy with an iffy past and collaboration with armed groups. And the hospital doesn't have the money to provide the services because he's getting a share of it. And Ana Luz knew this. It was, we didn't know it. The people who were there from the university studying the way they were asking or demanding their rights, the lawyer who had trained them to do tutelas. Then there's different versions of self-governance, which James Scott loves. They can be by constitution or legal delegation, which is kind of interesting. Historically, for us, for example, the Catholic Church governed large parts of the Colombian territory legally. But basically, the way they governed was the priests who were governing the land. We had similar arrangements, sometimes with corporations. But indigenous peoples, by government delegation, governed their own land. These neighborhood boards also have some sort of government in their neighborhoods. So there's some different forms of self-governments through community, through delegation. And I want to draw your attention to what does it mean to govern. If it's like a supply or a product that you're selling, if you're a government, so what are you selling? What exactly are you selling? So you're selling, here's one, borders, checkpoints, body searches, people need to have documents. It controls the borders and movements, who comes into your region, your neighborhood, your country, your town, and who can leave. And that's part of what a government does. It controls the borders. It taxes you. Everybody knows governments tax you. They take money from you in order supposedly to provide services. Even people who collect protection money, tell you that they're providing a service, they're protecting you. So it's an outright extortion. But most of them who will extort you will tell you that they're selling you protection. And this is something that I think is really important in a market-based society. Governments regulate markets and private property. And it's something that governments really need to do. As a lawyer, I think that there's no market without regulation, because then it's just war. And somebody has to regulate every single market. Somebody has to lay down the law in whatever market, whatever you're selling, you need somebody to lay down the law. When you have a country that half of its economic activity is informality, it means that the government is not regulating that. I bet you somebody is. Somebody's regulating that. So when you see people selling wares in the sidewalk, somebody's regulating that, and somebody's keeping other people from stealing their shit, right? And how does it work? There's a whole economy that's an illegal economy, and it has its own regulators. Dispute resolution, some sort of justice, basic goods and services for families and individuals, and the provision and administration of public goods. So here's where the state really has an edge. But if you look at the way drug cartels are functioning in northern Mexico, they're also providing this stuff. And they're really rivals of the government. So this is like some sort of typology of rivals of the state and their own internal laws. So this is what we teach: a constitutional democracy, human rights, state law, international law, and some communities are allowed some measure of self-government. Then you can have martial rule, which usually have like a state of exception, which its own special rules. Then there's government. We had that for a while, although people don't really realize it, and we don't really teach it in universities. We had government by a national security apparatus, which is basically secret police and different types of detectives that provide security for different types of organizations. And they do a form of government in the sense that they police borders, they limit who comes in and out of places, they limit who can do what in terms of public activity. And I can tell you from our investigations into the crimes committed by national security apparatus that it used to be really strong and so unmanageable that the president who decided to end it couldn't reform the institution, but merely closed it down and fired everybody, except everybody came into the other institutions with this experience. You have mafias, which you've seen in the movies. You have informal community regulators. You have legal companies in enclave economies or the church. And you have organized crime in enclave economies, and you have armed state actors. So there's really, and in Colombia, you can find all of this depending on where you go, which is why it's really important when you're doing field work to ask that first question, who's the authority here? Who needs to give me permission to be here? Especially if you're taking students, which could and have famously a couple of students in Los Andes been shot for not knowing these rules and being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that's supply side government. What's the demand for good governance? How do you get the consent of the governed when you're offering these services? What really would make the state, if you're trying to buy government services, why would the state be the best bidder? Why would you say, no, yeah, I want a state. I want a government. I want to pay taxes to the DIAN. I want to go to a public school. I want to be in CISBEN. This is all the stuff that I really want. I'm sure that that's the best life for me. So what? At the minimum, what people really want is and this is from a lot of almost 8 years of interviews and following internally displaced people around as they rebuild their lives. They really want somebody who will regulate markets and protect private property. If you're going to sell your wares in the street, imagine this, you're a 40-year-old woman, you have 3 small kids, you're going to use all your life savings and you're going to sell empanadas, right? And that's what's going to give you to pay a room that night and to feed your kids. You really don't need some schmuck to steal your empanadas or to steal your empanadas money. You need some sort of protection. You need somebody who's going to protect your private property, which is your empanadas and whatever you're making of it, and is going to guarantee that if you work all day, what you get at the end of the day is going to, you're going to be able to keep on living, and who's also going to make sure that no kid from Los Andes is going to come and eat your empanadas and then not pay, right? And then leave and not pay. You need some sort of security, and people really need that if they're going to get ahead. They also need some sort of protection from other threats and enemies. Like if this is your corner and this is where you sell empanadas, it's got to be your corner. I mean, you already got all the kids from Los Andes buying your best empanadas. You don't need some other lady to come in an hour earlier and just start selling empanadas. This is your empanada corner. You need some protection. But you also need people that you can trust, to take care of you. What if you're sick someday, but you really need to sell your empanadas? What if somebody really does steal your empanada money? What are you going to do the next day if you don't have the plante, which is the amount of money you need to buy the ingredients to make the empanadas? You need your people. You need family. You need networks that extend beyond kin. You need some sort of network of people who will have your back. You can call them insurance. I think economists like to talk about insurance. But for people on the ground, it means you need somebody who has your back. And frequently, this is what I found, that the rivals of the state do provide and the state doesn't. Somebody who has their back. You need, of course, some sort of stability, and then the rest are just extras. Like if they can give you some money, that's great. If they can give you public goods, that's great. But mostly, this is the stuff that people need when they're reconstructing their lives. And this is what happens in most of the world. The weak find somebody who's strong enough to provide this stuff for them, right? And what do they provide? Well, it took a while for me to understand how poverty really worked on the ground for the women that I was working with. And it's not really like you're poor all the time, every day of your life, forever and ever, because people work. And Colombians have this whole working ethics of salir adelante, I'm going to get ahead. Everybody in the family works. Asking for government subsidies is work, which is why people are generally not grateful when they get a subsidy. It's because they had to stand in lines for a very long time, fill out a bunch of forms, maybe give somebody a share of it. When they finally get the subsidy, they worked for it. It's not a gift. So they're doing all this stuff to get ahead, but there's always small tragedies. I'll give you a major small tragedy. Somebody in your family dies, and just the box to bury them can be worth millions of pesos. So where are you going to get the money? And you're not going to bury your grandma, without a box. Or somebody gets sick. Or somebody needs, somebody just got in trouble with the law and ends up in the police. You have all these tragedies where everything that you worked for years and years is suddenly gone. And that's when you provide your loyalty to whoever can help you at that moment in your life. So it's not that you need help every single day of your lives. You need some sort of backup. You need people who will help you when you can't help yourself. And in exchange, you'll provide enormous loyalty. So when people talk about buying votes, this is a way a lot of politicians buy votes. And it's not money at the table that same day. It's the growth of clientelistic networks of loyalty and obedience. And you also provide information in case the strong need information. Maybe you can provide for the strong people labor or merchandise or just outright money. But mostly what we provide is loyalty. And what the strong provide in exchange is protection and insurance. So here's a story from a coca growing region, is that usually, and one of the reasons why it's so hard to go after peasants who grow coca is strong networks of loyalty or traditionally, between the people who grow coca and the people who buy it, the middleman. So the first middleman is generally, or used to be, because I haven't looked at that in a while, but when I looked at it like 12 years ago, used to be what in Putumayo, which is where we did the interviews, called the chichipato, which is a middleman who's like a richer farmer. And he knows everybody in the region. And then he comes and talks to you. He's the middleman. And he tells you, look, you have a good land. Why don't you plant some coca? And so Mr. So-and-so from the cartel will buy it from you. And he goes to so-and-so from the cartel and says, look, no sé, Leopoldo's a good guy. He needs some money. He has a good farm. I'm sure he'll be good in his word. Why do you need to be good on his word? Because they used to call him, and I love this, the cartel guy, el capitalista, because he has the cash. So el capitalista is going to give you some cash. He'll give you $1 million pesos. And with that, you can buy everything you need to plant your coca crop. But you owe this guy $1 million pesos. What you produce is going to be worth, what, 3 million? And then he gives you the other 2, and he takes the $1 million that you owe him. So you're working on credit, but the middleman is super important, because if that crop fails, if it gets fumigated, then you owe the cartel guy $1 million pesos, and you're still a poor peasant. And there's no way you're coming up with $1 million pesos. And the middleman, the chichipato, which is somebody you trust, says, Leopoldo, don't worry. I'll cover your $1 million pesos, and we'll talk about it later. And now you owe him. And these are really strong networks of trust and loyalty and obedience that we never study or understand or teach, or take seriously the moral commitments that are involved. So it's not like ethics and morality or the province of constitutional democracy. They're all over the place. So Leopoldo, he's a good guy. He knows he owes this guy. He's not going to go bad on his word. He's grateful, and he's going to be an honorable man, and he's going to plant the coca, and the next crop, he's going to pay up his debt. And people want to be, it protects him a lot more. You know what happened after the 2016 peace deal? Some of these people in El Putumayo really bought the idea of crop substitution from the state. They said, there's not going to be more FARC. There's going to be peace. We're going to go all in on this, right? We are going to go for crop substitution. And they started promoting crop substitution in El Putumayo, risking the anger of the cartel guys, right? Then we changed government. The next government wasn't that keen on crop substitution. It didn't have the policy. The people in Putumayo were left hanging, and out of the 6 that we followed, they're all dead. So what's the role for justice and what we do at the HIP, which is justice offered by the state, by this state that you can't really trust as much as you can trust a chichipato in El Putumayo, because they might change their mind. And they don't really have your back. They don't really know your problems. And now we're offering them state justice, right? So I wear my robes and I come to these places and I'm like, hi, I'm the judge. I have justice for you. And who's the state sent me, right? I come from Bogota. For some people, it's another hustle, it's another gig. It's just they're trying to figure out if the HIP has money for them, And if because el rebusque, or finding money, the hustle, isn't just selling empanadas. It's also figuring out who has something for you, some charity. On the street, it's called projects. So who has a project, where you can work and maybe make a buck or two. But a lot of our work has been trying to build trust in these communities, that they will trust the HIP, that they will see that somehow we can take care of them in some version. And what we can provide, and what we do provide a lot, is we listen a lot. And there's a huge need in this country. So this stuff happened 25 years ago, and people have rebuilt their lives. And I'll tell you, there's a huge need in this country for healing. sometimes, and a lot of what people want now, that they have a house and some sort of stability, and their kids are finally out of school, and they have their health insurance card. They want somebody who will listen to them. And we provide a lot of that. We do a lot of listening. I have a psychologist that teaches us how to listen. And she says that it's amazing, the therapeutic power of the law. And someday she wants to write about it, because she says, if I tell them something, they don't believe it as much as when you say it with your robe, say that was wrong. And it helps people to realize stuff. So we do a lot of that. We try to articulate a shared morality even with perpetrators who tend to agree publicly that what they did was wrong. So we try to articulate a shared morality, and we support reconciliation. We support the reincorporation of former combatants. I still think that someday we'll have to forget everything that happened, but I still feel like we're still cleaning up, and that's sort of what we do. And we promote or sell the idea, which you might believe in or not, that the state is the most legitimate form of government. Yay. So that's me there. I like that picture particularly, although I've done it all over the country. But that's in Miravalle, Caquetá. I could only go to that place for the first 2 or 3 years of the peace deal, because now it's being run over by dissidents of the peace deal. But when we got there, they told us, in the whole history of Republican life, this is the first time that a judge steps this part of the country. And that was like the biggest structure that they had, and they were listening to perpetrators. And that's what I wanted to share with you today.
Thank you, Julieta, so much for this super, and just please sit in the middle, because I'm just sitting here so I can see people. And so we'll open up for questions or comments that anybody in the floor might have. So let me start.
Stop.
Just to, yes, sorry, please.
And I really admire you because all you have achieved. But I was wondering, you just said at the last moment, now they are full of dissidents. Do you mean that all this process was abandoned already, or is it something that it's continued and it's been going?
So here's an interesting persistent construction of Colombian peace processes, is that every peace process has a part of the group that was intended to be reincorporated into the state who forms a dissident. You can trace it back to the 1953 peace deal, Rojas Pinilla peace deal, but every single peace process has had dissidents. This particular area of the country is very valuable for these groups, although they're much smaller and don't have the firepower that the FARC ever did. They're FARC dissidents, and they don't have the territorial control that the FARC ever did. So, and as you saw in the data, they don't have the capacity of inflicting harm on civilian populations that the previous conflict did. But I assure you that in that part of the country, there's FARC dissidents, there's ELN, and there's a bunch of paramilitaries who never demobilized, and there's cartels, and there's a lot of illegal armed outfits that just basically control part of the country. But they're small, and there's hope, I think. But Miravalle is particularly valuable for them because that's where the FARC started in the eastern part of the country. So it's a part of the country that has symbolic value for them, which is why it was so important when we were there. And it was one of the first regions of the country where they immediately said no more state officials can come here.
Yes, thank you for your talk. I thought your analysis of the empanada woman and I guess the logistical considerations, financial considerations was incredibly nuanced. And I just wondered if you could say more about how you came to that insight, just about everything that sort of such an quote unquote informal operation requires? And also, if you don't mind saying more about what kind of economic analysis you'd like to see along those lines of people sort of taking seriously what seems like a kind of ad hoc, unsophisticated operation, but that actually has like all the components of a kind of business enterprise.
Yeah, I'm sure this happens all over the world. And if you just listen to people, they'll tell you basically, and I'm sure everywhere. So let me put it this way. I used to be a feminist activist, and once I read an ethnography of feminist activism, and I thought it was ridiculous. It was the most basic thing. I couldn't believe people were getting paid to write this. And I think that's the way they feel about what we do. And I certainly got a lot of pushback when I listened to people. And when I asked questions, their first reaction was like, are you stupid? So now I'm really self-conscious when I try to explain things because I have their voice in my head asking me like, are you stupid? What's wrong with you? How can you not get this? And so I'll try to say it, but I'll just say that I'm very self-conscious. So if you're going to sell something in the street, you need money to buy what you're going to sell, right? And that's in Spanish, they call it el plante. They have a specific word for the money. And that's sacred. Because if you eat el plante, the next day you can't work. So the first thing that you need to know is you need el plante, and that's sacred money. Even if your kids are hungry, you're not spending that money because that's what buys your ingredients. And we used to call it vendedores ambulantes, thinking that because they didn't have a storefront, it wasn't like a regular thing, but it is a regular thing. And if you buy from them, you'll see they're always in their corner. Even the guy who asks for alms has his corner. So you have to have a corner. And there's competition to have the good corners. And then in Bogota, there's parts where there's like, so the government will call them a mafia, but there's governance of the streets. There's somebody who guarantees that's your corner. And usually then you have to pay them in order to guarantee that. So, but sometimes the person who guarantees that, it's based on goodwill. So sometimes it's like people, they're your friends. So they'll tell you, yeah, sure, you can work that corner. And you're not paying them anything, but you're part of a care and trust network that says, no, hey, this guy, he's legit. He can come here. That's his spot. So there's all this world that really moves around that. And that the only place where I could understand it was just asking the people who thought I was stupid because I was asking them about it. And we did that with a bunch of students for a few years, just ask people and hang out with them. And sometimes you'd have to pay them to let them hang out with you, which made sense because, they're teaching you and you're basically stupid. You don't know how anything works. And that's how, and I have no idea how an economist would approach this, but I would tell you that that's the life of half of the country. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julieta, for the talk. It was really, really interesting to hear all these stories and the way you frame it. I have two questions, which are the first one is quite specific, but I thought about the common concern about the kind of other side of forbearance that is also perhaps present in some cases, aside from the one that you mentioned. Like, it makes sense, and I agree with you that it's a good decision that we realize if there's someone who's desplazado and arrives in a city and has nothing, we cannot just pass the bulldozer. We have to find ways of slowly making them part of the legal structure and having them being regulated by ordinary state rules rather than being informally located and so forth, even if they are not sismo resistentes. So I completely agree with that. On the other hand, there is the concern I wanted to ask you in the context that you have looked at, that forbearance can also sometimes be not just leaving these people to the regulation of people they trust and care and so on, but actually to regulating actors that can be very arbitrary and can be violent and so forth. So those two phases of forbearance, any insights that you have based on the settings that you have studied, I thought would be interesting to learn more about it. And the second question is, I am moved, and I thank you again for what you're doing in terms of the role of justice after the war. And I don't miss any opportunity to tell people who have left the comfy places of academia to take on these jobs to say, like, thank you for the public service. And I wanted to ask you, aside from the role of justice after the war, what is your view now of the role of justice before the war as something to avoid the war? Because it seems when you mention what is it in your experience most people demand from the state, that the state is not doing well. You mentioned protecting enemies and other threats, and of course justice is like central there. But then the other part of network care and trust and so on, it's not so obvious that that's the role of justice. So I was just wondering your view of justice not only as a tool to taking care and cleaning up after the war, but what is its role to preventing other wars and before hopefully avoiding future violence.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you're thinking about the proximity between the law school and the economic school and our shared endeavors. So justice is a big word. There's a way in which is pretty outright, which is that I put on a robe and I represent the state. Generally, I go around the country with a Colombian flag. Like they have to pack my flag, and if they don't pack my flag, I get angry. I'm like, where's the damn flag? I can't do this without the flag. I need the flag to be in the picture because I'm justice. I represent the state. And I don't wear the robes unless I'm representing the state, but we go to these very precarious places, and I'm there with the robe and the flag, and I'm justice. But as you can get it from the way that I'm saying, I'm sort of skeptical of my possibility of being justice. And how does that work? What does it mean for people? What has really surprised me is the importance of that care part. Like a lot of the people that I listen to understand my limitations. And they're kind of okay with that, as long as they feel that I'm doing my job like sincerely, right? And I remember there was this guy he's a victim, and he had worked with us, and he was talking to these other victims, and they interviewed him for a show, and they asked him, what does the HEP get you? And he says, well, the HEP's weird because they don't really have projects, so they don't really have money, but they get you a psychologist. That's what he said. I said, and that's good because, I'd never really in 10 years or 15 years talked about what happened to me. And it's true, like for victims who participate, we provide some sort of group support and some like basic instructions in self-care, or we tell them stuff like, this is what post-traumatic stress feels like. And he was trying to tell, like you don't get the money, but you get this. So maybe it's and then I wonder, like, is that what I am now? Like psychosocial support? Is that what justice is? So I do think like it's constructed in the dialogue. And then there's that other question about like, how are we planning to extend what we think is the best form of governance, which is, I don't know, a constitutional state? How are we planning to get that to half the country? Like, what's the plan, right? And sometimes I think that we don't really have a plan because we've never really thought about their lives, and we just think that they're illegal. And then, like, probably a bunch of them should go to jail is one answer. Or somebody should get rid of them, which is also a very common answer. Just get them out of my space. So I don't really think that as a state, we have a plan for the transition between this whole other world of informality And it's like they tell people, you should get a job like that pays benefits, like a formal job. That's what you should do. Or you should go to school and then get a job. Or maybe your kids should go to school and get a regular job. But it's like the only plan we have, you guys should get a job. And so I think that if we understand better, we can figure out the transition better. And there was one story that it's actually in the book that you like that really opened my mind to this. And it's this community leader who finally she gets land and she convinces a bunch of women who are living in her poor neighborhood in Monteria to go to that farm. They're going to set up a cooperative and they're going to start farming. And they're really happy and they get there and they start farming. And then the paramilitary warlord of the region comes by and says, you guys look like, you don't have much. You need food. We could get you some food, mercados, which is like the Colombian way of saying like groceries. We could get you some groceries. And she says, we didn't even have salt to make salty soup to feed our children. And we told them no. Says, and what she was trying to tell me was that accepting groceries from somebody, it's like a form of accepting their governance. With that help comes power. And so she said, we didn't have salt. And we said, no. We said, we don't need your groceries. We have enough food. Thank you. Go find somebody who needs the groceries. And so sometimes I wonder if the state doesn't really approach people like the paramilitaries. Like, we have groceries for you. We have healthcare. And you should sign up for this without really taking the trouble to establish some sort of relationship of trust before that.
Julieta, I want to take you back to the poem of who cleans up the mess and your taxonomy of the supply of government. Because in your taxonomy, you have 5 types. And in a way, you answer partially my question in the sense that one of the 5 categories of your taxonomy was the constitutional state, to clean up the mess. And the title of your presentation is Reconstruction. And again, the poem of Szymborska. But which of those in that taxonomy is really effective, you think, from the perspective of people to really clean up the mess? Because the constitutional law, I can see why we should all try to think to defend that idea in an idealistic way, but probably naive way. Then the next categories are messy to clean up the mess through violence, illegal violence, corruption, manipulation. And I'm only thinking the last category, which is true self-governance. And you mentioned there James Scott, and I was telling him when I was sitting here, you should mention Elinor Ostrom in there. Maybe that last one could be also a clean way to clean up the mess, along with the constitutional. But I wanted to hear more because I don't see the others in your taxonomy cleaning up the mess. It's just transforming the mess into another mess.
Yeah, well, I have a bias in favor of the constitutional state because that's a way. That's a way that I was raised. It's like my religion. Like I remember I was interviewing an indigenous leader once, and I actually had to do it through an indigenous assistant because the leader wouldn't talk to me because of the face. And then she reported back the interview, and I told her, you need to press her on why do indigenous people use the law so much? I mean, the state has failed them so much. Like, why are they speaking law so much? And he says it's because the law is the religion of the state. And you have to, and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. So it's hard for me to see it outside of my religion, which is the belief that everything can be better with a constitutional state. But the closer that I can get to seeing that is that in the way that I understand that I was taught that I believe in the constitutional state, there is no place for civic friendship, like even theoretically. the idea that you have friends in the state, that's immediately labeled corruption, right? The state cannot be your friend. The state needs to be impartial, it's rule-driven, there's no personal connection there. And, that's complicated because we're very social beings, and generally we long for personal connection. And one of the things that I ended up documenting in that book is a whole chapter on those public officials that forego the idea that there are no friends, the street level bureaucracies, and who actually establish relationships of care with with their constituencies. And they do so always worried that it's illegal. Because you can't really be friends with that would be, and I asked, and I did those interviews, and I asked one of the public officials, so do you consider these women your friends? And she said, no, that's illegal. We can't be friends. And she says, but they did care. So I do think between the spaces of the constitutional state, we make it work because we establish personal relationships. And I have no theory for that. I can only tell you that all this stuff, the Unidad de Víctimas, all those programs, the HEP, everything works is because we have public officials who, even though it's probably illegal, establish relationships of care with the people that they're working with. And they get their numbers, and they send them WhatsApps, and they send them happy birthday WhatsApps, and they ask, so how are you doing, and what happened with your kid? And actually, that's what makes the state work. And we have no theory for that, and there's apparently no place in the Constitution for all that affect. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's what I saw.
Hi, thanks very much for your presentation over here. I was really intrigued.
Because I think Juan Camilo knows where I was going, but I want to wrap it up. A lot of those other forms of governance do provide friendship, and they have their own codes of honor. Spurs. And real. Have you ever heard of honor among bandits? Yeah, so you can have even the neighborhood kids who are stealing stuff. They have some sort of code of honor, and you can be friends with them. And sometimes they offer that, and the state doesn't. I'm sorry, I want to close that idea. I left it open-ended.
No, that's absolutely fine, dude. I was really intrigued by the example you gave of the cocoa grower, calling the El Capitalista, and this supply chain of debt and money and land, it seemed to me to evoke structural and social relations, which is a little bit different from where the presentation started in the supply and demand framework, which is about individuals exercising choice. So I was interested in that tension between a kind of structural and social and individual. So my question is, in your experience, how has structural and social or class power influenced the exercise of state power and the law in your experience?
Right. So this is why I wanted to start with a poem, because I said that poems don't have theory. I think that our reality is incredibly under-theorized. And basically, what I try to do when I write is to try to tell these stories that bother me, because all the theory that I've read in my academic career does not explain what's going on. And then I do a lit review and try to figure out if maybe I haven't read the right stuff. And then eventually I get to the point where I'm I just have to tell the story, because I have no, and I don't really do much theory. I just try to explain it in a straightforward way. But I do think that these are all stories or anecdotes because they're not theorized. So in terms of methodological approaches, what's been more useful for me is anthropology. And those are the tools for understanding these realities that have been more useful, because anthropologists tend to not have structural analysis at least the modern ones, like the contemporary anthropology, they'll tell you this is what happened. And they have like a small T theory of what's happening, but not a big T theory of structural analysis. All societies are like this. This is what always happens. Fun fact, ask an anthropologist if he's read Bourdieu, which he should, because Bourdieu does anthropology, but then they don't, and it's kind of a fun conversation to why haven't you? And so I'll say that, like, I don't have level theory. I wouldn't know how to do it. I don't know who's doing it. But I do think that it needs to be done, and that it needs to inform our political, scientific conception of the state. And then so that we as lawyers, and that's a real we, because I'm just a lawyer, can come up with better laws. And if you're going to come up with better laws, then we need like somebody who can understand this in some sort of abstract way so we can do better laws. And I don't know who that is. I'm sorry. Maybe I just have been away from the university for too long, and you'll tell me, oh, no, you have to read so-and-so. That's the person. That'd be great.
So we have one last question before we finish.
So thank you very much for your presentation. I'm very convinced that it was a wonderful overview, and especially this, I guess, a social theoretical framework of complex relations between state and the markets and social actors. But my question is about another point that was left open, maybe about community leaders. Why exactly?
Yeah, that was left open, but because people trust a lot of power. I don't know what. So the closest I've got to finding a theory was this German professor, Sibyl, and I can never pronounce her name. It has a lot of consonants. Schwarzen, I'll find it for you if you're interested. And she has like a theory of a feminist approach to civic friendship. And it's sort of helpful to think the way that power relationships are structured in this sort of half places where the state doesn't really govern it through its bureaucracies are personal relationships of trust and care. So in the example that I was giving, like Leopoldo has a personal relationship with this guy who's mediating his selling his coca paste, right? And this is the important guy in that region. So he's the real power there. And if you are coming in as an external actor and you want to get power quick, then you have to deal with that guy, because it's the guy that people trust. It's the guy that people love. It's the guy that people will do stuff for. Otherwise, they'll just ignore you, like they ignore some authorities. Like they ignore the whole prohibition scheme in plant coca, And so that's the guy they kill. So they wouldn't, if a new power is moving into that region, they're not going to kill Leopoldo. They're going to figure out who's the leader and try to come to an agreement with that leader and tell him, okay, so now all the coca paste, all these guys in the region are producing, now you sell it to me. And that guy will say, but I have an agreement with so-and-so. So-and-so is my buyer. And people are loyal. It's like, I think it's in our genetic nature to be loyal to our in-group. So they say, no, I'm part of this in-group. This is a guy that buys coca for me. Yeah, they kill him. But this is happening at different levels because it's the community leader that stands up. It's the community leader that stands up for other people who can't stand up for themselves. So it's they who become the obstacle. And as power has been shifting in this relatively ungoverned by the state regions of the country, it's community leaders that need to go, and new community leaders that are going to have to be put in place so they can intermediate between the new powers and the people on the ground. I don't know if Colombians saw it because of the recent elections. There was one of these TikToks that circulates about a woman who sells votes. So she's a community leader, and there's a traditional form of politics, which in La Costa, where I come from, is called La Política. meaning politics. But for you guys, maybe you want to give it another name. But politics, la política, means that in neighborhoods, there's a leader who moves the votes, right? So the leader owns the votes and knows how many votes she owns. She has 300 votes. She can sell those votes to a politician, but she's really an intermediary because she's giving something to these 300 people who are voting, whatever the politician promised. And it doesn't have to be cash. It's actually the lousier politicians that need the cash. But it can be like your kid is going to have a spot in that good public school. They're going to guarantee a spot there. And the leader says, I got your kid a spot in the school through so-and-so, but so-and-so needs you to vote for him, and they will. And there's a TikTok of these leaders who are she's really, really angry. She's like, what am I going to tell my voters who voted and now you're not giving me what you said? And she's furious. And she's outraged. It's a moral outrage. Like, what am I going to tell these people? I gave them my word that you were going to give them some cash, and where's the cash? And so people make fun of it, but it's the way this world works, and this is their role. They're carrying the world on their shoulders, these community leaders. There's a woman who works in Yafit. She wrote a wonderful ethnography of this type of politics in Monteria and in the circumference region. And she has an anecdote that I love where she asks in the way that as academics will ask, like very arrogant. We get to the poor neighborhood and we know that they're selling their votes and it's bad to sell your votes. And so she asks him, what has politics ever done for you? Why do you keep voting for this corrupt politician? And the leader tells her, politics made that road. Politics got those roofs. Politics, that's what politics got them. And she has a long list of the stuff that politics got them. So I know it's not the state it's supposed to work, and it'd be great if it worked the way it's supposed to work. But then, ordinary people are neither stupid nor corrupt nor criminal. Intelligence and morality are generally democratic. So intelligence and morality are not like, oh, we're going to focus on the rich now. Like people are smart and, and more moral everywhere.
So with this, we come to the end of this conference. Thank you, Julieta. Thank you. I think there was, what I'd like to keep is this tension. I don't know if you felt it. I felt it throughout your talk, between this kind of disbelief and still keeping hope in this is possible. This shared morality that you talked about with care, trust, connection, maybe your redefinition of civic friendship. And I think that's the kind of things that in economics we should be looking at. So thank you for this very enlightening conference, and thank you for all your work for the state and our religion. Thank you. Thank you all.